This is Matthew Cratter from Bitcoin University, and today I want to talk about how Bitcoin mining has zero carbon emissions. This is not exactly a true statement. It may not even matter. As you're going to see, it's a bit of a troll, but I hope to cover in this video some very interesting things about Bitcoin mining and the electrical grid that I was not able to cover in yesterday's video, which was about the New York Times attack piece on Bitcoin mining. So let's begin with a paradox. When you plug your Tesla into the electrical grid, you're a good person. When you read the New York Times online using electricity, you're also a good person. When you stream documentaries about climate change using electricity, you're a good person. But the moment that you plug in your Bitcoin mining rig to the same electrical grid and use the exact same electricity, all of a sudden you're a bad man. You're a very, very bad man. My video today takes its title from this very funny trolling that Pierre Rochard did, which I'll link to in the description notes below, where he basically walks around the Riot facilities, which is a big Bitcoin mining company, and measures CO2 emissions. And of course there aren't any because these are just machines using electricity. This is the whole point of it. So congrats to Pierre and some really good trolling. But I think it's an important point to make because most people in the world still have no idea that Bitcoin mining uses just electricity, obviously uses mining rigs as well. But when you say mining, we probably should change the word to hashing or something. When you say mining, they envision environmental destruction like this. This is what's behind the gold standard. This is how you mine gold. This is what's behind EVs, solar panels, etc., and ESG. This is a lithium mine. And so if you're the New York Times and you want to make an article about Bitcoin mining, you're going to doctor the photo as they did and make everything seem really hazy. If you're enjoying this video so far, I just ask you to hit that like and subscribe buttons to help support this channel. So just to recap, when you plug in your Tesla, your computer, or your Bitcoin mining rig, you're using the exact same electricity. You're not more virtuous just because it's your Tesla and not your Bitcoin mining rig. Now, of course, this does tell you nothing about the power generation mix that created that electricity, and this power generation mix may include natural gas power plants, coal power plants, nuclear power plants, and then what are widely called renewables, though they're not necessarily renewable, which are solar, wind, and hydro. So yes, that electricity may have carbon emissions associated with its generation, but it's unfair to blame only Bitcoin miners if they use that electricity. When Amazon Web Services, when AWS opens a new data center in Texas, does the New York Times run a massive article about it? No, they don't, of course. But the New York Times does run articles about Bitcoin mining companies using the exact same electricity because, as we discussed yesterday, the New York Times hates Bitcoin. The New York Times is the paper of record for central bankers, for investment bankers, for fiat politicians, and for other rent seekers. And as we pointed out yesterday, the New York Times has been in the same family since 1896. So this really is a legacy business. So of course it hates Bitcoin because Bitcoin threatens to break all of this open and completely change the system and not make it the same system where you can control the propaganda machine for so many generations. Now I want to go on to tell you some facts about power generation that you may not know, and these will be helpful if you want to go back and read this New York Times article. The first question, of course, is why not just go 100% wind and solar? Well, of course, it's because the wind doesn't always blow, the sun doesn't always shine, especially at nighttime, even in Texas. And then you have places like Europe that don't really get that much sun or wind from a power generation standpoint. Europe is certainly not as sunny or as windy as a place like West Texas. And the only reason that countries like Germany were able to virtue signal about wind and solar all these years was because they were buying natural gas from Putin, but now they're burning lots of coal to create electricity, or they're just burning wood in their fireplaces at home to stay warm during the winter. So this suggests that the German Green Party, other green parties, the American environmental movement as well, doesn't actually care that much about carbon emissions as it cares about preserving its control. It's important also to point out that mining lots of lithium and cobalt for solar panels, for EVs, for batteries, building wind turbines, all of this requires lots of hydrocarbons, in other words, fossil fuels. I don't really like that name fossil fuels. I think it's a propaganda term, so I prefer to use hydrocarbons because you're not actually grinding up dinosaurs or destroying priceless fossils to create hydrocarbons. So behind all of these renewables really are still hydrocarbons. Also hydrocarbons if you want to run the electrical grid efficiently, because you cannot run a grid on intermittent energy sources like wind and solar. And we're many decades away from battery technology that would make this possible. Even if we had the technology today, you still need these giant mines. And so when they do the carbon accounting, they're not really taking into account the mining of the lithium. So we're still many decades away from this. And what this means is that you need to have either natural gas power plants, often peaking plants, or nuclear power plants, both of which are non-intermittent sources of electricity production. They're very steady as long as you have the underlying fuel. They're not like wind and solar, which are intermittent. And I'd say if you're worried about carbon emissions, and not everyone is, but if you are worried about carbon emissions and you're simultaneously against nuclear energy, which is zero carbon essentially, you're not a serious person, or you just don't care if old people freeze in their homes in the winter or die from heat stroke in their homes in the summer in Texas or Florida. You also probably don't care if babies die in the neonatal intensive care unit, because an electrical grid needs to be built so that it can handle peak demand. And that means that most of the time the grid will not be using all of the electricity that it can produce, which leaves room for Bitcoin mining operations to make use of that otherwise wasted energy. And this is one of the key points that New York Times article doesn't focus on. Bitcoin miners can use that electricity that would otherwise be wasted and then turn it off on a moment's notice if the grid operator requests it. And that's something that data centers and hospitals cannot do. They cannot just shut down. Netflix or Amazon cannot turn off their servers in Texas just because electricity prices happen to be spiking. But Bitcoin miners can do this. So Bitcoin mining really helps to incentivize the building out of a grid. And you have to build it out for peak demand. And most of the time, you're not going to be encountering peak demand. But you build it out such that it's big enough that it can handle peak demand and be ready for peak demand when it comes. When peak demand comes, when you have a winter storm in Texas or a summer heat wave, the Bitcoin miners can easily turn off their machines. Now, this is called a demand response program. Demand response for the past decade has widely been considered a good thing and part of the environmental movement, part of the way of making the grid deal with renewables, except when Bitcoin miners participate in it. And this is really the hypocrisy of the people at the New York Times. In fact, the New York Times actually brags about its own demand response program in this article here, where they lower the shades, etc., in the New York Times building when it's really sunny, for example. And so when the New York Times does demand response, it's a bad thing. But when Bitcoin miners, it's a good thing when the New York Times does demand response, but they criticize Bitcoin miners when they do demand response. Again, you just cannot run an electrical grid on intermittent energy sources like solar and wind. When the sky gets cloudy or the wind stops blowing, the grid operator needs to ask natural gas peaking plants to fire up to cover the shortfall. And there's really no other way around this unless you want to live in a country with brownouts like Pakistan or Venezuela, etc. What's an even better solution? I would say build a lot more nuclear power plants in the US. They're not as bad as the Simpsons cartoon would lead you to believe. They're zero carbon if you care about that, and they offer non-intermittent, reliable power generation. Guess who thinks that this is also a good idea? China is planning to build at least 150 new nuclear reactors in the next 15 years. I don't think the US has built a new nuclear reactor in my entire lifetime. And so if we want to remain competitive, if we don't have brownouts, we need to also be pursuing the nuclear route. I'm going to link at the end of this video here to a couple resources. You can read up more on this. This is a great, this is the Q4 report from the Bitcoin Mining Council. And we can see here global Bitcoin mining is 0.107% of the world's CO2 production. And there's some other interesting statistics in this. So I'll link to this in the description notes below. I'll also link again to the video that I mentioned yesterday, why Bitcoin mining is good for the environment, and ways in which Bitcoin miners can help to prevent the unnecessary venting or flaring of natural gas, as well as absorbing and using methane gas from landfills, from garbage dumps, burning it, converting it to carbon dioxide, which is much less dangerous as a greenhouse gas. So I'll link to that as well. And I'm also going to finally link to this article from the Bitcoin Bugle, obviously a parody, but New York Times regrets pumping Bitcoin price. We'll focus future effort instead on starting a war. If you found this video helpful, be sure to hit that subscribe and like button. Hit the notification bell if you want to be notified when I publish my next video. And let me know your questions and comments in the comment section below. Thanks a lot for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.